Alright everyone, it's time to talk about the Abe Lincoln bullshit that's happening right now because I have maybe a more nuanced view of the situation than most people that are commenting on it. Most people are either like, "Yeah, well, Abe Lincoln, fuck him, basically he's a white male, so, he should be erased from history," or they're going crazy right now. "Oh my god, you're erasing history and stuff." To be clear, with the San Francisco High School, it's, I guess, Abe Lincoln High, they want to change the name as part of a general thing where they're changing the names of a whole bunch of schools there. I oppose the idea. Erasing history is invariably wrong. That being said, the fundamental claim at least that's being made by the proponents of removing the name and replacing it, are technically true. Now, indigenous people, again, with an asterisk by that, indigenous people, I'm indigenous to the continent, most of you are too. That's basically a wrongfully used term. With regards to that, who cares? Has nothing to do with the additional addendum to that, which is like, well, Abe Lincoln didn't demonstrate that black lives mattered to him, so he shouldn't be on the school. Now, people find this ironic because Abe Lincoln, of course, is the great emancipator, freed the slaves, wonderful guy. Semi-true. Let's delve a little bit into history. Abe Lincoln, for instance, number one, was a member of the American Colonization Society. While he believed in the progressive freeing of black individuals who were enslaved, it was partially for economic reasons. The North was industrialized, didn't have or need slavery. The South, of course, where he wasn't from, was agricultural. In some ways, the plantations pre-industrial at times, and so they did have slaves. The arrival of the cotton gin and other inventions basically negated the economic usefulness of slavery for plantation agriculture. This was something even most Southerners at some point realized, like, hey, why are we clinging to this particular practice that no longer makes any feasible sense? A machine that costs $50 can do the work of $1,000 worth of slaves, so why are we engaged in this? The American Colonization Society said, well, they should be back in their home continent. Essentially, they made a biblical argument about this. The biblical argument was, well, God put these people in Africa. Why did we bring them here? It wasn't so much a moral opposition to slavery. Like a lot of abolitionists, they didn't really have a moral opposition to it. Abe Lincoln certainly didn't. He stated repeatedly in and out of debates in both public and private that he didn't consider black individuals to be his equal. He also stated unequivocally on multiple occasions that he was ambivalent on the subject of freeing the slaves. As far as the northern freed slaves went, there were concerted efforts up until around the mid-1800s, towards the end of the Civil War. Abe Lincoln's running low on manpower, he's running low on a mandate to continue his war, and he's like, well, I don't want to be remembered as the dude that lost the Civil War and thus led to the breakup of these United States. I know what I'll do. I'm going to fuck with the South by emancipating their slaves. It'll destroy their output. It'll cause chaos, and some of them will come here and join the cause. So, nobody in the North cared if a bunch of slaves went off to fight. They didn't care if there were black casualties because they were all, by modern standards, bigoted. They didn't care. And then they, of course, many of them fought bravely in the Civil War. They come back as veterans and still treated like shit, of course. They finally, long after they get the vote and everything, very interesting. But people who don't understand history, they look at Abe Lincoln as a larger-than-life character who was very solemn and moral in how he treated these issues. And that's a mythology. And it's a mythology largely built at the beginning of the era of American imperialism, with the Spanish-American War, World War I, the U.S. beginning to throw its weight around in foreign theaters for the first time, really. And the reason why is this. During that period of you could say civic nationalism in the United States, a burgeoning high level of it. It had already had some nationalistic tendencies. Before the Civil War, though, a lot of times you're not really an American, you're a Vermonter or a Virginian or a Texan. Afterwards, in order to continue congealing the Union, what happened is that the northern politicians engaged basically in a star-studded propaganda campaign lasting multiple decades, from Reconstruction all the way up past the First World War, that segues into the Cold War, by the way, in the wake of the Second World War, in simply a different form. Abraham Lincoln and George Washington and a very small other number of people were lionized. They were held up on a pedestal. All of their possible human faults were completely forgotten. The history was also changed. In the wake of the Civil War, Roanoke is forgotten about. Plymouth becomes the big thing, now doesn't it? Hardly anybody even talks about Roanoke, but they all know about the Mayflower and all of this other shit that went on. They know about the Plymouth Bay colony and pilgrims and stuff, but they don't know anything about the Roanoke colony. Or Sir Walter Raleigh. They've never heard his name. He's been erased for propagandistic purposes. I edited a book not that long ago called Abe Lincoln, Practical Mystic. It's an interesting book. While it documents real historical superstition that Lincoln had, odd events he experienced, dreams, premonitions and stuff, and he does seem to have had some casual occult views at the time, potentially. He had weird visions, and you could say, well, you know, back then people, they used opium and still smoked weed regularly sometimes. They certainly drank a lot. Maybe he was just delusional. We're not going to get into that. But if you look at the document, early 20th century, it comes from this golden era of Lincoln worship, and I point this out in the preface, in the foreword. This is indicative of the kind of literature you get at the time. There was a burgeoning effort to portray Lincoln as being specifically the ultimate American, the absolute creme de la creme, the standard by which everyone else was judged, the most solemn biblical Abraham in history. He's basically like our Moses, essentially, leading people out of the darkness of slavery and states' rights into federalism and racial inequality, but it takes another 100 years, but, you know, better late than never, I guess. That's essentially what you see with the view of Lincoln. And so the idea when people get hot under the collar when someone points out he didn't care about black lives, he didn't. He threw him down the gauntlet in order to relieve pressure against the war. He didn't emancipate slaves in the northern states that had slavery still. He didn't emancipate them because they were still useful to the northern economy, what agriculture existed in those margins along Dixieland. But Dixieland lost hundreds of thousands of people, because what the slaves realized when emancipation was being spoken of, oh, you mean Mr. Lincoln has freed me? Well, I mean, they can't shoot us all, and so they would run off the plantation. Now, before it had been one or two people or maybe a small family normally that escaped. Normally, it was very small. The whole idea was to be stealthy. Now, with emancipation, everyone hoofed it at once by and large. The South was gutted. The South had already had economic problems, and then Lincoln marches in with Sherman and burning Atlanta and all of these other things and yada, 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 and the rest is history. The Lincoln worship cult is fundamentally wrong in its surmisings about Abraham Lincoln. He had racial views in line with the norm at the time. He did not emancipate northern slaves. He emancipated the southern slaves primarily as a strategic tactic. Probably wouldn't have done it at all if public support for the Civil War had been high. And Abe Lincoln, by the way, was a very fallible leader at that time. For several years, at the beginning of the war, he continuously put in charge incompetent generals who fucked up over and over again. Have you ever heard of McClellan? Great strategic genius, just like must have been obsessed with chess. The problem is that he would give the enemy several days to dig in while he planned the battle, even when he had a clear strategic advantage according to his scouts, because he was ultimately a coward. And he did this over and over. It isn't until, what was it, 1864 or something that the Union Army, or 63 at least, that the Union Army has any competent leadership whatsoever. That was Lincoln's fault, the commander-in-chief. Some of the plans that they did worked. They build a bunch of submarines, and sometimes they even work. It was just a president, a human being. But people want to worship him. That being said, though, I don't agree with scrubbing his name off of a school, because if you apply that standard, if you apply the standard that you have to be perfect to be remembered, what are you left with? Nothing. These people would love to put fentanyl overdose George Floyd high school or something like that. I'm sure that the chemistry department would be very, very interesting. It's not the case that this is an infallible individual. It's also not the case that that's historically meaningful. Try and find me one. You're never going to. That's about all. Peace out.